All right. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Nathan, and we are having a panel discussion on Christian traditions and contemporary American culture. We'll just do a brief introduction. Um, my name is Nathan Woods, as I said. Uh, my background, very briefly, I wasn't raised in the church, no Christian traditions at all, although my mother was raised Catholic. Spent a lot of time um, exploring, for lack of a better word, New Age spirituality, and I was recently baptized as an Orthodox Christian. Um, how about from here I'll just pick a random order for the introductions. Doesn't have to be more than what I gave there. We'll start with Andrew, and then say Cassidy, Dave, and then we will have Charlie joining us at some point this evening. And if you could just give very brief background for your um, upbringing, Christian or otherwise.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Nathan, for setting this up. Yeah, so I'm Andrew. I was raised and still am Catholic, and I've not really treaded too far from that path. So I don't have any crazy twists or turns, as I guess some of the other people in this chat will. So
Great. So my name's Cassidy. I grew up Protestant. Probably 4 years ago, I went through a deconstruction that didn't end up making me lose my faith, but made me rethink sort of the way that I've always believed. And so when I started reconstructing, I ended up back at Protestantism and tried a bunch of different denominations. I grew up in more evangelical churches, non-denominational evangelical, but I, went a little bit of a denomination hopping when I was going through my exploration, and looked at other religions too, Islam, Mormonism, all that sort of thing. But ended up back at Christianity. Ended up what I now call a default Protestant because through my research, Catholicism never really sat well with me. So Protestantism is where I landed back at. But as of recently, I have been exploring Orthodoxy. So I no longer claim any sect or denomination, but am looking into the conversion process and the theology of Orthodoxy.
Yeah, my name's Dave. Grew up Pentecostal and left when I was age 18. Um, Became agnostic, atheist, and wandered around for a number of years. And then, as I started to explore coming back into Christianity, um, I encountered I first started going to a traditional Anglican church and met an Orthodox priest there, a Greek priest, and he started talking. Both of us started talking and um, invited me to the liturgy. Actually, I think the first thing that I went to was a Vespers. Um, but I was pretty much hooked from the very beginning, and wasn't too long after that that I started my catechumenate. And then a year later, I was chrismated Orthodox, and so now here I am.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. Well, as the title of this talk suggests, we're going to be focusing on Christianity within an American context. Uh, to start off, I want to open this up to the panel. Uh, do you feel like there is a particular focus that American Christians have at the moment? I know that's a very general question, but yeah, I'll just leave it there for now.
I think it probably depends on the tradition, but what I've noticed from American Christianity, and I think I got a lot of clarity too because I studied abroad in Australia, so I was there for a year, and I was actually in Australia as I was going through my deconstruction, and something that I did realize about American Christianity and the way that I had seen it is how uh, American it was. It was very commercial. It was very independent, and it was very yeah, self actualizing. And whether that's good or bad, I I don't know, but that is something that I have noticed through a lot of what I've seen in churches in America. And although I think in some ways there are some facets of that that can be good, uh, it, it has a lot of weaknesses. I think in the grand scheme of what it is to be church.
Yeah, I guess it would very much differ from denomination to denomination. I I don't know of any specific differences or focuses. So, I don't know. Dave, do you have anything?
Um, my experience has been pretty insular. So, um, I'm pretty much out of touch the rest of Christianity within America. Um, a lot of what I've learned by being on this Discord and hearing names, sometimes very big names in uh, Protestant evangelicalism, at least, and not knowing who those names were and having to Google them and people laughing at me. But um, so yeah, I really don't have much of a uh, picture of what's going on uh, out there too much.
I mean, it's hard because I think there's just so many different um, goals for different churches depending on the denomination, and not just the denomination, but where they sort of line on that spectrum between more conservative to more liberal. Um, it's it's hard to pigeonhole that. I think you can look at specific movements and say, okay, these are general things that this sort of movement and branch of Christianity is really focused on. As far as like total um, themes altogether, yeah, the individualism is something that I think is one of the biggest things of like it's your individual choice and like you're responsible for you. And there are good things to that, but I also think it sometimes can diminish what it means to be church and like how we work together to encourage each other towards, you know, being godly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
So,
What do you think, Nathan?
so yes, to jump in here, that was really my sense coming into this conversation was that at this point there isn't really a cohesive American Christian identity, and of course a lot of that has to do with our history and the fact that we're largely a Protestant nation with um, the Catholics and Orthodox sort of not working on the peripheries exactly, but there are a multitude of traditions, but something along the lines of that individualism that you were mentioning is uh, that seems to be very very prevalent within the different churches. Um, I guess sort of part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion was a sort of ecumenical in the best sense. That do you feel like there is something that could unite Christians, and of course that comes up will come up against what is a Christian, which I know we've all heard Paul talk about. Um, there are obviously some churches that identify as Christians who, um, for instance, wouldn't believe in the resurrection. And we don't have to get too far in the weeds there, but do you think there is something that, given all the problems uh, very well documented in the news today, um, that that could unite the different traditions within America?
I think I'm pretty optimistic. Personally, I sort of verbally started to think through this idea when I was talking with Charlie recently. Um, and I think the in a strange sense, there's going to be a benefit from the amount of people deconstructing, and that's going to be the benefit is going to be that the people who are, in a sense, left are going to be people that have gone through the trials of and tribulations of this very interesting, strange, and not a society that directs us towards specific religions in a sense. So I think what's going to be left is sort of some very strongly imbued, distilled people who will know what they're sort of talking about, but I think also hopefully have a ability to have good faith conversations like we do on this Discord, and then be able to talk to Protestants, Orthodox, Catholic, and have very wide breadth conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm pretty optimistic too. I mean, especially in the sort of last little bit of time that I spent in a lot of Protestant communities, there did seem to be this push to, create a bridge between, the Protestant and Catholic division that sometimes exists in American churches. Um, Although orthodoxy is never talked about, which is the
Yeah,
funny thing. It's always like Catholics and Protestants, but nobody talks about orthodoxy. Um,
they're just on the top of the mountain chanting.
yeah, yeah. They're out of the conversation, just doing their own thing. Um, and so I am hopeful. I think one thing that we can sort of all agree on probably, and I'm gonna sound like Luke Thompson right now, but like I think love is something that can, in some ways, bridge the divides and the differences. And I think that's what you see with some of these conversations. And even if we're disagreeing, there's a sense of respect and love and like a search for truth and seeing how, if you're actually loving your neighbor, like trying to find the truth is important. I think that's a huge thing, and trying to really uncover all of this religious stuff. And I don't think it just exists within our own Christian denominations. I think that extends out to other, maybe sort of uh, like break off of Christianity, or completely different religions. There has to be that like love and respect going into those conversations to ever get any like first of all, get anybody to change their mind, but second of all, be open to having your mind change.
Yeah. Good
Yeah,
conversations start with love.
yeah, I would say that. I mean, looking at the diversity within American Christianity, um, kind of what you see, especially with the fact that Protestant denominations split so often. Um, um, you kind of have to understand the history of going through this scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment, and then you have this one group of Protestants that kind of lined up, uh, mainline Protestants who sort of embraced the Enlightenment. But then you have the fundamentalists who um, uh, took it on as their mission to combat um, the Enlightenment, but in a strange sort of way, because they did it in unwittingly, I think, in the sense that they used the same epistemology as the Enlightenment. Um, and to me, it doesn't seem that this fight against the Enlightenment is the way to go. It seems like that fight has been lost. It seems like we need to get back to the idea of some kind of harmony between the symbolic and the literal. And I know I've talked about this with Andrew some. We've divorced the symbolic from the material world such that the word symbol is now taken to be something that isn't real, quote unquote real. And if we can rejoin that symbolic to the material, to the sign, to the signified, which is really the proper understanding of the word symbol, and yet retain the good things that came out of the Enlightenment, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because the Enlightenment has such a powerful tool of epistemology, and that can't be denied. But without trying to say that the Enlightenment per se can give us our values, which seems to be the modern error. That it really is mythology and religious sentiment that gives us our values, and that the Enlightenment gives us tools, perhaps, to enact those values. I don't know. I mean, I see it. It's a grand challenge, but I see this not only in Orthodoxy, but I see this in all American Christianity, that there is this struggle between the people that are deconstructing because of things such as evolution, say. And I don't think that this really needs to be happening. If we understood the place of the Enlightenment and the place of the symbolic, mythological understanding of our roots. But then the question comes, how do we put this back together? I don't think that we can do it through the dialectics of Hegel, a synthesis, thesis, or a thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis. It's less of a synthesis than a harmony. I would think. That we let science be science without trying to interfere with it, and most importantly, try not to infer values from it, and to realize that it is nested inside this narrative, this religious narrative that has been going on for time out of mind, really. Um, and only then that the symbolic religious can impart value through mythology and story without adopting that materialistic epistemology that arose in this scientific revolution and culminated in the Enlightenment.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
That's all great stuff, and I I couldn't find anything in any of your responses that I disagreed with. Um, Now, for me, the question is, how do you get people to engage with and enter into the story? And I know not, I assume not everyone here is a Christian, but I would think the majority of us are. Um, I mean, not everyone is a nerd like us, you know. So, uh,
Who do you call a nerd?
Cassidy mentioned.
So mean.
I say that with the utmost respect. Cassidy mentioned love, and I think that's something that even as almost meaningless as that word has become from overuse, just about everyone can get on board with love. But how? Yeah, like I said, how do you get people to engage with the story of Christ? And for me, the Paul's project with the conversations and this little bigger than little community that's created around him, that is a great thing. It's a it's a step in the right direction. But I'm thinking that there's deeper work to be done than even at the conversational level, and not to diminish that because that is serious work. But and I have written down here in my notes, love your enemies question mark, and I'm just, out of all the radical propositions of the Bible, of Christianity, that Christ has called everyone to do, love your enemies seems towards the top of that list. And I'm really not seeing that from many parts of the country, in the Christian community is is really slacking in that, in my opinion. Um, what and maybe there isn't a good concrete first step, but is there any thoughts on how Christians can display and show and actually love their enemies?
Yeah. I sort of in the outpost, in that little server that Charlie's doing, in that weekly conversation, I sort of suggested the topic of estuary as a place of ecumenical conversation, because when I heard estuary, I was like, oh, this, like, while it shouldn't be a place totally colonized by Christians, it definitely, I thought of the value of ecumenical conversations, and I sort of previewed my thoughts there for myself, and I think part of estuary is, in a sense, the solving of this problem. And my and I also, sorry, I want to touch like just a tiny bit on. I feel like there's something else a bit with what Dave said with just the epistemology and the there is, I don't remember the quote by Pope John Paul II, but how he phrased basically the existence of God was just like this. It was a great way of like saying that you don't have to look at everything through this, that like the natural sciences have this narrow lens that can't encompass everything. And I'm not bringing the full force of his thought there. But yeah, sorry, that was side tangent. But
Yeah, no.
the I do agree with you on that. The continuation, basically, of this needs the love of your enemies, and I think maybe also how I sort of started was with the distillation of, in a sense, the people who are still going to be around and going to church every Sunday. I think maybe it will be easier. Hopefully, that's the hope. I could also see it going the other way, where everyone is just like so in their little nook that I don't want to talk to those stinking Greek Orthodox down the road up the mountain. Like they're just crazy. Like, why would they, say, like, why don't they just believe in Felique? Come on. So, yeah.
Well, I guess, and I agree with what you're saying, but I mean, there's obviously animosity between the different denominations, but
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to use the boogeyman of today, but in America, there's Antifa. Let's say, Antifa comes to town and they're burning down buildings. Like, obviously, there's a point where, yeah, you defend your family and whatnot, but what should be how could Christians love Antifa? I guess to make it a little more concrete.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think to that point, an ecumenical movement that wasn't focused on, um, uh, you know, ecumenical movements tend to be focused on, well, what can we agree on doctrinally? But if there was an ecumenical movement that just stated up front that we're not going to agree on everything, but that what we're going to do is go into action um, with each other to attempt to love our enemies, as you said, and what that would look like, and for instance, to love Antifa. This could be something that would be transcending the materialism of um, fundamentalists and transcending um, um, the churches that um, um, are ignoring the aspects of the Enlightenment, so to speak, and you could have um, both people that were participating in both ways could come together and take action to potentially love their enemies and have a witness for Christ.
I think it's really hard because we want a formula, right? We want an action step. We want a procedure to tell us how to do it and what's the best way to go about that. And in some ways, that's very American as well. But
Hmm.
God doesn't really work in formulas. Um, he more often works in paradoxes. And I liked how you stated the question, Nathan, of how do we get people wanting to be part of this story? And I think in some ways the answer is to live out the better story. And when we're living the story, and for us Christians, it's the story of Jesus and how he asks us to live, I think people will be drawn to that story and want to live it, and not in a counterfeit way that we sometimes see in sort of consumer Christianity that's trying to sneak people in, if you will. Um, but there's different, and I mean, I work in the entertainment industry, and there are people who I am colleagues with who are Antifa supporters or sympathetic to their cause in some ways. And yeah, I think sometimes it can be hard to know how to balance that, and be able to love your neighbor, but also not pretend that violence is a good thing.
Yeah.
And so it's a tricky balance. um, I don't know. I don't know if there's a particular answer, and I think every situation's different. Um, but I always try to just look at Jesus and what did he do, and I think most often what he did was criticize the religious leaders, speak truth, and spend time with the most um, what's the word, disenfranchised group of people that he could. And so I think when I look at the Christian church, the American Christian church, and especially a lot of Protestants, I don't actually see that. I see a lot of people gathering around in buildings that have people in them with the same ideologies and thoughts that they do. And if it's not comfortable for them, they find another building with another group of people who align better with their ideologies. It doesn't really seem like we're living out the right story.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. You mentioning stories again, sort of, I lost it in his question, but that I think is one of the most important things because it all sort of works on the story level. I think a lot of what, like for me personally, what got me to going back to mass after like not really going for a period of a few months was reading Lord of the Rings and his deep, like, it's just like so undercover though. Like the Christianity in um Lord of the Rings is just like this such like subtle undertone, but it speaks beautifully to in a sense your unconscious brain as well. Just perfectly like smuggles in there. In a sense it smuggles Jesus in. Stories are Jesus smugglers. They're the perfect Jesus smugglers. And they I mean it captivated me. And I think that is the way that one of the ways that we can love someone that doesn't love you back. And I think, and so also, I really agree with what Dave had to say on the ecumenical side of things. Um, in the beginning of Brett Sockwood's Transubstantiation book, he talks about how there's been a lot of failing in um, the ecumenical conversations between Catholics and Protestants on the subject of the Eucharist and transubstantiation, and how a lot of it has just been, or that the conversation just hasn't been talked about when um, between Catholics and Protestants. With that, it just is sort of like covered over because it's like, oh, this giant Pandora's box of crazy theology that just we're not going to conquer in a sense. They sort of defeat themselves before they even start, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think some of the issues with working out theology between denominations is that we're all using the same words, but oftentimes we mean different things by the words that we're saying. And
Yeah.
that's what I've really realized exploring all of these different denominations, where at times where I grew up Protestant, so there's this ingrained Protestantism in me in the way that I think and the way that I operate. And before I went through my journey, I had these answers that made sense, but I was looking at it in a Protestant frame and realizing, oh, wait, this Protestant idea that I think this is what Catholics are saying, or I think this is what the Orthodox are saying, or what they mean by what they're doing is not actually what they mean. And I just had to take time to stop and actually listen. And I think sometimes we don't do that well because religion is something that is so important to us. It's deeply ingrained in us, and it's for most people who are devoted to it, it's the foundation. And nobody wants to admit that there's cracks in their foundation. That's a scary thing. But like until we ourselves are willing to stop and be above just the what we want to be true, to like pursue what's ultimately true, that's when things start to change. And I think a lot of people are trying to do that within their different denominations. But sometimes when you're growing up in it can start to become rhetoric where we're saying things that we don't even know what we mean.
Yeah, and I think uh, maybe one way to approach ecumenical dialogue between the different types of Christianity is um, uh, not to focus on, not to focus in so much on um, our differences, but um, what is it that we can um, what is it that we can do in this specific context to demonstrate our love for others despite of all the differences, and be able to put those aside at least for a little bit, and then to see what the fruit of that is. um, um, and in that way I think that um, I think that for each one of us, you know, whether we're Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, if we're interested in drawing other people, whether they're Christians or not, into our faith tradition, that it should be based on what our tradition is rather than what it is not. So it should be attraction
Mm,
rather than promotion.
mhm,
And so, less words and more action, and um, through collaboration, perhaps different people will gravitate towards different communities based on what they are rather than what they aren't. Because so often I see that, just to take Orthodoxy, for instance, I see so many people that jump on board or get curious about Orthodoxy because, um, well, they get on board because they're like, uh, it's not what I grew up with. And what I grew up with was um, terrible, or or they perceived that it was terrible. Um, and so what they're looking for is kind of a blank slate, and they're looking for something that can perhaps give them something completely different. But what they're doing is they're running from something rather than running to something. And so, if each of us in our different traditions were able to display what we are through our actions and out into the community, then that could create a way of attraction rather than something that people just ran to because they were angry with another tradition.
Well, so if I can jump in, first of all, sorry for being late, but um, when I see people leaving Orthodoxy or Catholicism, the main complaint that I hear from them is I never actually had the chance to study the Bible and really try to think through these things. And then the other way around, what I see is a psychological difference of it doesn't feel real. It feels like it's all taught but not caught, to use some PVK language there. So more of a psychological difference where they want all the senses embodied in the service, whereas it's more mental focused in a Protestant tradition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just real quick. Glad you could make it, Charlie. Could you just for any folks that don't know, could you just give a brief introduction for yourself?
Oh, sure. I am from rural Arkansas, and I am a Southern Baptist theologian. So we're one of the crazier. Well, I don't want to say crazier. No, that's not right, because it's hard to get Baptists to do anything, even clap. Like amen is pushing it. We're definitely a different Protestant denomination than most, and being the Southern Baptist part, we are we skew heavily Republican. Dallas Theological Seminary. I think everybody kind of already knows that, but maybe not. Yeah, that's where I come from.
Great, thanks.
And just to piggyback on what Charlie was saying, perhaps like say if Charlie and I were to engage in some form of missions or outreach and to try to show the love of Christ to a community. Some of those people might be attracted to the Southern Baptist Church. Some of those people might be attracted to the Eastern Orthodox Church. But for Charlie and I, we could potentially draw strengths from each other's traditions. Like I could draw, or I could say my entire parish could draw a strength from his tradition, in the sense that we could learn, as lay people, we could learn the Bible a lot better, and we could have more teaching, and he might be able to draw more participation, bodily participation in worship, say. But neither of us would actually switch from Orthodoxy to Southern Baptism or Southern Baptism to Orthodoxy, but there would still be something that we had to learn from each other without having to sit down and hash out every doctrine and how propositionally we were so different.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Dave. That's great. That's actually the question I was coming up to was basically what do you think your tradition does well, and what can be learned from other traditions? I know you mentioned you know the Orthodox. Um, there's this idea, and it's or a stereotype, I guess, that I've heard from some of my Protestant acquaintances and friends that we're not that into the Bible, and I'm sure that's there for a reason. There's some truth to that, and that's something we could definitely learn from the Protestants, their reverence for the Bible. But I guess for the panel, um, and I know this will be a little different for you, Cassidy, because you're sort of um, not settled in any particular denomination. But what do you think your tradition does well, and what could be learned from the other denominations?
Southern Baptists, in particular, are very good with um, missions and Bible studies, like trying to get the people that are going to go out and do the missions to, at the very least, learn the basics of how to share the faith. So we've got all kinds of stuff. I mean, you can get tracts on the Romans Road. You can get ones on leading people through the Gospel of John, which is usually extremely helpful. They're very centered around that, and I think they're very good at it. What we could get from the other traditions is there's going to be those people, like I said, psychologically that are drawn to the other, and you don't want it to be like the parable of the sower where only a third of his seeds actually sprout, right? You want as many of them as possible. So you know I think ideally, if you were to have an interfaith mission, what you might do is you might grab people that are Eastern Orthodox and Catholic, right? Because they are, at least from what I've noticed, in foreign missions, extremely good at getting people in and at retention. Like they can explain things in a way through their services that are all really sense based. Like they focus on all the senses all at once. There are a lot of people that are really into that, and it keeps their retention. And I don't want to say it's just about the numbers, but I think I've found a whole lot of extremely faithful people in both of those traditions, whereas Southern Baptists are really good at getting them in, but the retention part, you know, it'll fall off after a generation, and then we're left wondering why. So a good mission would have all those kind of people involved. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, so I think I definitely would agree with a bunch of what Charlie said, at least with the other traditions. I think one thing that I want to touch on is what Catholics definitely do well is um, here's some Latin for you, via pulchritas. I think I have that right. Is way of the beauty, and it's sort of one of the sort of evangelical, what our evangelical, how we evangelize for people the best is way of beauty. So we show them the beautiful cathedrals and the beautiful art, the beautiful statues, and that's sort of just like that visual sensation is, I think, what we do incredibly well. And also, another part is sort of the history, and that's a big part for me. I mean, I love the history, the old stuff. I can just sort of be like, oh yeah, like these church fathers are like in line with my tradition, and it's great. Like these guys from 300 AD are totally with it in a sense, and I can get something from that. And I I would agree with what we definitely lack on is like, I mean, it is a bit of a stereotype, like, oh, Catholics don't read the Bible, and it's a bit true. I really didn't read. I don't think I've read a full gospel until like, ooh, I don't know. It might have been like this summer or something. Like sat and like read all the way through Mark in one day or something. So it's definitely like there is something to that. I also didn't go to a Catholic school, so maybe it would have been different for me. But I think also something that Protestants do very well is catechesis, at least for the more conservative denominations, I would guess, and that's something we don't really do well. I I think that's a lot of where the issues are for Catholicism.
Yeah, and I wish that, well, at least my tradition, I wish that more of we could we could get a good balance of not only biblical scriptures but also reading early church fathers to go along with it to get more of a full balanced view. And I don't think that that would require us to like convert our tradition to anything else, just read the church fathers to go along with it and be like, okay, like here's this scripture, here's what I think about it, and here's what theologians 500 years before me thought about it, or even further back, however far back they want to go. But like just to get a full balanced picture of, I have this thought, oh look, this early church father had this same thought, so maybe there's something to it. I wish we were better at that for sure.
Yeah, and there's so many strengths that each tradition has that can offer to other traditions without us having to come to perfect doctrinal uh, unity, and ways that we can show love to communities through missions, um, through outreach, ecumenical outreach, more so than ecumenical dialogue, which a lot of times just reaches dead ends.
Yeah,
I,
I'd agree with Dave. I think there's each denomination, and I haven't been in a lot of them for a long time, but I've experienced a lot of them briefly, and they all have the things that they offer to the church body and the way that Christianity works. And I think they all have their weaknesses too. I know that I don't specifically subscribe to any at the moment with confidence, but I can kind of talk about some of the ones that I've experienced more fully. So I spent a lot of time in evangelical cultures, and I think one of the things that is really appealing to evangelical about evangelical churches is the passion that people have for God in those communities. There's a genuine love and like passion to seek God in a way that isn't always present in some other traditions, and it manifests itself in not just a thought of missions of like outward outside of where we are, but seeing it within our own communities and looking to actually serve and help and in some ways quote unquote save those around us, which taken to its extreme can be a bad thing, but in a lot of ways is very appealing. And there's a lot of good to that, and um, I think it was the thing that drew me the most to evangelicalism. But what I think Orthodoxy does really well, and you could probably say the same thing for Catholicism. It adds a level of sacredness to worship that doesn't always exist in Protestantism, especially in non-denominational churches. I think most of the churches that I have gone to as a Protestant were uh, set up in old warehouses or YMCA's. Very rarely are you surrounded by really ornate, beautiful buildings. And there is something to that sacredness and just every little thing having a meaning. Because my first Orthodox service was a Vesper service, and the thing that I was so drawn to was just knowing that the liturgy and every single thing that they were doing had a meaning. And even like I didn't know the meaning, but I knew it had a meaning, and there was an intrigue to want to know what it meant. And I think Protestants do have their own sort of rituals, although I don't think we always acknowledge them, but they're not quite as deep as maybe some of these older traditions. So yeah, that emphasis on the sacred and the tradition is something that I've grown to really appreciate.
Great, thanks, guys. Now, I want to get into questions here very shortly, but I just want to go back to something Dave said because it's something that I've been thinking for a while. I see a lot of dialogue between the denominations as basically fruitless, if not outright counterproductive. Do you, obviously you want to keep lines of communication open, but I get my own opinion is that, and we've touched on this already, that uh, maybe a more action missions based collaborative approach might be appropriate. Does anyone have any quick question or quick comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is.
What?
If it does, yeah. I think sometimes it's fruitless, sometimes it's not. I think a lot of times it depends on the individuals and how they're really approaching it. And I think sometimes we just have to wade through and accept that sometimes, as a consequence of human beings, some of those conversations are going to be fruitless. Um, but I don't know if changing the way we do them is going to make it more productive or not. I think it's a distinct possibility, but I think it's more changing our mindsets ourselves.
Yeah, and
Well,
I can say from experience, I've done some volunteering at a homeless shelter, and it's a Christian outreach, but there are mostly Protestants, some Catholics, and one Orthodox. Guess who? Um, but that during that time when we're feeding people or we're talking to people, uh, no one is bringing up theological debates about the filioque or why the the Orthodox and Catholic Church why there was the Great Schism or any of that. All of us understand that we're doing this because of the love of Christ that He's shown us, and that we're we're in turn showing love to our neighbors. Um, and I've been involved in missions in Honduras too that had that same thing, Catholics, Orthodox, Protestant, and nobody talks about doctrinal differences when you're hanging drywall for a building, you know. Um, and so that that focus on love as action seems to be very key as far as binding Christians from all different traditions together.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that. When I've done quite a few projects, and I'm going to plug one of them. It's actually called World Changers, and it's for the most part sponsored by the Southern Baptist Convention, but they do a lot of plucking from other denominations, including Orthodox and Catholic. And what it's done through the youth group. So I did it a couple times when I was a youth pastor, where these kids actually, their parents wind up paying for them to go on this mission trip, and it's hard physical outside labor. So whether it's re-roofing a house or cleaning up someone's yard or painting their house or whatever it is, we just go into these lower income communities and would just blitz out projects for a week straight. And I noticed both of those times, all the local churches, it didn't matter what denomination they were, every single church picked a day to feed you breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And nobody complained about it. And then I was in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina and worked on Project Noah, rebuilding houses in Louisiana, and you had the same thing. You had a whole lot of different people from different denominations that were there just, and you work side by side with the guys, and yeah, you may ask them questions, but it never got into like deep theological debates because everybody was focused on a mission. So as far as what Nate is saying, I think the conversations, they can be seen as fruitless, but when you get people out on a job and actually physically doing things to serve the communities, all those differences just kind of fade out to the periphery. Nobody cares about them at that point. So that might be an answer of how you get people to
Good point, Charlie.
engage in that dialogue, but also like that engagement with the community. The community doesn't care what denomination you are. It's just like, you're here, you're helping us. They see Christ. They don't see your denomination. And I think that is a purpose-driven thing.
Yeah. On that point, I will say that I think sometimes the discussions, although I think they're incredibly important, I think sometimes they end up becoming these control mechanisms of us trying to understand God and put him in these boxes. And I myself am very guilty of that sort of thinking. And so I think there's definitely a place for them and they're helpful. But when we do it in the wrong means, in the wrong way, instead of really just trying to learn more about God, but to figure him out and put him in this box, it can actually be more destructive than just taking the action and doing those things. So it's a real balance to strike.
Yeah, and I think what Charlie was sort of describing in a sense was this like slow acting, and I think the best conversations are the ones through action, and in a sense, not even with words. And we are also just fickle, neat people with like just this big fat neuron at the top of our head that is sort of crazy half the time. So, and we're sort of crazy half the time. So, I think it's always going to happen where we're not going to have great conversations, a decent portion of the time, and in a sense, that's also why we're having this conversation, because some crazy, fickle human beings, for the Great Schism 1,000 years ago, we're like, I hate you, because of this crazy Greek translation, and then, in 1500 or whatever, I can't remember the exact date of Protestant Reformation, but, then, another crazy bunch of people were like, "Man, you crazy Luther guy and you crazy Calvin guy." So
I think the downfall was when we actually had time to sit around and think about the theology, whereas
yeah.
when everyone was just having to act it out, things were a lot better.
Yeah.
And I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, let's just tear the whole thing down. It's like,
Mhm.
no, I think thinking about the theology is okay sometimes. But, you know, if my neighbor right next to me is Catholic, I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm not going over there and helping him because that's some Catholic. Like, no, I'm just going to go do it. I don't care about the theological difference. Like, don't care. You need help, I'll help you. Like when everyone just acts that out, I don't think we have as many problems.
Yeah, and I think to that point, we I think sort of how I started was we're gonna have an easier time doing this and having theological discussions because this is sort of an era of information and also, at least with the utility of Discord, we're able to actually have this conversation. So we have a bunch of information at our fingertips, and we can look at things, and then we can also ask people like, oh, I looked this thing up. Is it good? Like what what's your thoughts on this, and how is it embodied by you yourself?
All right. Thank you guys. Let's transition into Q&A. We can open it up to anyone in the chat who has a question. So whoever wants to go first, we'll just do the free-for-all method. There's probably a better way of doing it, but I can't think of it. So if anyone has a question, just shoot.
I have a question. So, does anyone think that there is a utility in having different denominations?
Yeah, I think I do. I think when I really think about it and I look at all of the differences, I logically get to the point where I think, well, there's probably one that is more true than another, and very likely all of them have something not quite right. And like we can do our best to try to align our best with the most true thing, but I think there are places like I look at my journey and I think if it wasn't for Protestantism and the non-denominational churches that I was able to be a part of, the idea of God and pursuing that probably wouldn't have been a thing that was palatable to me. And through that and being disenchantized by what that was led me to orthodoxy and opening to other religions. So I think for me, I see those have a place, and I look at other people who are walking in faith and trying to pursue God who feel deeply connected to a different denomination, and I don't think that there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with that. I think we're all on the journey trying to figure it out. So I do think there's a utility. I think there are issues that come along with it, but I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah, I sort of agree with that. As we sort of was one of the questions before was we all have in a sense something that we do better than others, and I mean each one sort of has a little bit of each other in it, but we all sort of accent different um, portions of Christology. We all sort of have our um, little like dents in a sense, little spots that we go to where we're like, this is our specialty, like this is our specialty, and we're gonna make beautiful cathedrals all through the Middle Ages, and we're gonna make them great. And then later on, it's gonna be, we're gonna make beautiful Bibles. We're gonna get a good translation, and we're gonna, spread it across America and do a great job at that. So there's, it's like a yin and a yang, but they're all in a sense in the same circle.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if the way that we have some of these denominations, if it's sort of similar to this idea of the body of Christ and each of us having a different role, and how different denominations can teach us a different thing about how to be godly in a certain sense.
All right, so who's the liver? Who's the kidney?
Yeah. we'll get real close in the anatomy, just figure it all out. But I don't know, I always had that. I just always have that thought sometimes of like, well, maybe these are just different, different manifestations of, doing God's work in different ways, and we each have different callings and different functions.
That is such a good analogy, Cassidy, because I was just thinking about that today, like in preparation for this conversation. It's like there's all these different denominations and different churches, and we're all called to be the body of Christ. Well, a hand and a foot are not the same, right? So it's like all these things are separate body parts that make up the entirety of the body of Christ. So you'll have someone like Luke, who is a disaffected Protestant. Well, why? Well, it's just psychologically for him, Orthodox makes more sense for where he's at. And for me, I'm more internal, temporal, like really like to think through the scripture a lot. And I mean a lot. I'm heavy on the analysis of it. So maybe Catholic or Orthodox doesn't work as well for me, but there are things that I glean from it that I learn new pieces of information. And, same with everyone else. When we're having these discussions, we get to glean new pieces of information, but just from a psychological standpoint, one denomination or another works better for that particular person. And I say whatever brings them closer to God. It doesn't matter what denomination it is, as long as it's bringing them closer, it's worth it to have it. I'm sorry that we had all the fights to get to where we're at, but it's worth it in the end, I would say.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I would lose my mind if I thought about a Bible verse for more than a day. I think even for 2 hours, I think I would start losing my marbles. So, but yeah.
And that's all I do in preparation.
Oh.
I just analyze the heck out of it. And I look at it and I think, like, okay, this is my first glance of what I think to be true. And then I look at it and hope and pray that the way that I'm seeing it is not the way it is.
The Protestants are the brain, Catholics are the heart, and then Orthodox, what are you, the liver or something?
Going back to what I was saying before, I think there may be a way to draw from different traditions that are positive that you could incorporate in some way into your own practice without compromising anything in your own tradition. And through us coming together and talking like this, and then perhaps even at some point when we could, working together and showing outreach to a community, it would only strengthen that. But I don't see it necessarily taking away from any one of our traditions to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's sort of this. All of these denominations are a double-edged sword, where we get a lot of good things from it, but we get a lot of bad things from it. And my hesitancy to say that it's all good comes from experiencing really toxic branches of Christianity and individual churches, and those things taken to their extreme, and um, you know, sticking to a certain set of ideologies that stick within your denomination and otherizing people who vary. And so, there's a balance of, you know, standing for truth and trying to find a denomination that doesn't just make sense to us psychologically, but that really holds truth. And it's really hard to suss because our beliefs are uh, built by a million things, personal experience. Uh, Certain events can change the way we think about things. The evidence that we've seen and how we've been brought up, our lenses and our structures of thinking, um, and I think that's sometimes where we get the infighting. And so if we can find a way to address the fact that we have all of these different things and still love each other, but still be in the pursuit for, truth, you get a good balance. But a lot of times that gets out of whack.
So, Sherry, you asked if you thought there was any utility in the different denominations. For myself, 2 years ago, I wasn't even a Christian, and a big part of what attracted me to Christianity was that it's not utilitarian in any sense, any worldly sense. And honestly, there was a point where I wanted to become a Christian, and before I really took the dive, and I remember thinking, I really don't. I hope I don't. If I do become Christian, I hope I don't become Orthodox, just because there's just so many. They just lay so much stuff on you. There's all the obedience and the disciplines, and um, so for me, I just have a hard time, and part of this I'm sure is my background, but I have a hard time understanding why anyone would be a particular Christian denomination if they didn't think it possessed the fullness of the truth. Um, and that's why I'm Orthodox. If I thought it was the Catholics or the Baptists or the non-denominational, although that's obviously non-denomination, I suppose. I yeah, I
In some ways,
Wrong.
it is.
Wrong. Non-denominationals are Baptists with a fancy website. Everybody knows it. I take that back. There's one caveat. There is a very small group that is mostly Pentecostal, and they claim to be non-denominational. They're just very toned down Pentecostals.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm with you, Nathan. I think that I don't want to. I don't want to believe claim to believe something unless I believe it to be more true. I think as I've searched and why I've been so drawn to Orthodoxy is I've realized that a lot of these things that I grew up with, that I used to think made sense, are starting to shift and break, and these Orthodox traditions and theologies make more sense of the story and settle better than Protestant Protestantism ever did. Now, that doesn't mean that's necessarily true, but it's interesting. And so I think for me, taking that time to try to figure that out, and I think that's why I ended up in sort of non-denominational churches, because I didn't want to tie my horse to any specific denomination. And I don't think we should do that lightly. But I think that's what we do sometimes. If we grew up in that, that's what we identify with. And yeah, like there's a chance that you were born into the right religion and the right denomination. Um, but there's also a chance you didn't. So how do we challenge those things to get to a better understanding of denominations and how we can parse apart the truth between the corruption? It's really difficult.
I go with the 95% rule. I'm dead serious. I believe 95% of Southern Baptist doctrine, but I always leave that other 5% open to being wrong about something.
Right.
And that's how I can't go 100%, because if I do, I close off conversation to everybody else. And
Right,
that's
And no,
sorry,
and no, perfect.
Yeah, and I mean, so as someone who has stuck with the roots of being a cradle Catholic, in a sense, I almost did the reverse. I was like, man, this is like some weird stuff. I don't know. I mean, I don't really know what to think about Protestantism. I'm sort of familiar with this thing. I mean, it's been around with me this whole time. I was like, let's just take in a sense, when I was like 17 or so, I sort of took a step back, and I didn't really become, I don't know, atheist or agnostic. I don't really know what I would have said if someone point blank asked me. But in a sense, I took like a mental step back from it, and then coming back fresh eyes last year was perfect in a sense. And it was strange because I was like relearning, but also in a sense just going back in touch with it in a sense. So interesting process though, in a contrast between Cassidy.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about it, I tend to be a believer of like I can't have certainty about anything, right? I can have confidence in certain things and feel more certain that something is true, but 100% certainty I'm never gonna get. And so, at a certain time, you're jumping and you're taking a leap of faith. And I think the best thing we can do to, maneuver through this landscape is be honest with ourselves and be willing to accept the things we don't know, accept what we believe, and be up for the challenge and committed to truth. And that's all you can do. And like I've talked to Andrew, and I tell him all the time, like I don't get Catholicism, but like I respect that he believes it, and I'm sure there are so many things that I don't understand about Catholicism the way that he does that makes him believe that, and in the same way that I think maybe what I'm learning about Orthodoxy is different than he does, and that's okay, and that's part of that journey of like trying to find genuine faith. But I mean, I look at people who are on that search, that genuine search, no matter where they are in that moment, and like can respect that. And that's a big part of maneuvering this stuff.
Yeah, it sort of comes back to your Dave's the epistemology point, where we try and natural science religion. We try and just stuff it in there and like, oh yes, it's got to be 100% accurate. It's got to be binary. My brain's got to be binary. My brain's got to be perfectly ordered and centered. No bugs, no issues, no finicky things. And then you're gonna find a bug in the system and you go, oh my gosh, it's gonna terrify you. And I think we need to accept. I think most of the time it's just the accepting of we're not going to know much at all. So
The only thing I know is that I don't know.
that's the only thing with that we can say with God.
that I
Yeah, I think my main point was that we can't make religion serve epistemology, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't because epistemology it doesn't produce values for us, and so really epistemology is nested inside religion, and so we need epistemology, but we need to understand that it's a limited tool that has to serve something that's higher.
I think we often do a disservice trying to fit it in that frame, and that
Well,
sort of,
we've been doing that for 200 years at least.
yeah. It's not helping, I don't think.
All right. Does anyone have anything else?
Nathan, didn't you have other questions that you sent to us individually?
Well, um, I honestly I don't recall. Cassidy, I know I sent you something. Do you remember what that was?
Yes, I can pull up the question. What
I
was
mean, I am I organize this sort of, but I'm like the anti-organizer, most incompetent person you could have asked to
Okay.
do this. So if I did or if I didn't, apologies. Nothing on you guys. Yeah.
So you sent me this question. Um, do you think cool people, however you take that, your own age, would be more likely to convert to some brand of evangelical Christianity or to orthodoxy, and then why?
That's a great question.
It was a good question. It's been knocking around in my my brain for a while, and I think the word cool has got me stuck in a certain way because it's so fudgy.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and yeah, I've never considered myself cool, so trying to get in that framework of what do cool people do? I don't know. But I think yes and no. As far as evangelicalism, I think there is a certain type of cool that gets caught up in the hype and likes the way that evangelicalism in some of its more modern uh, versions doesn't feel as stodgy, and they feel like they can be a part of that and still have fun and still love Jesus. And like in some ways, I think it doesn't. It does a disservice because it becomes more of a trend than like a genuine pursuit. But what I have noticed though is that there have been people who sort of fall in that sort of cool or enjoy the hype of everything that actually are not attracted to that sort of thing. In fact, they find it pandering and sometimes ingenuine. Is that a word, right? Disingenuous. um, and so it's hard to say whether it will, for sure, whether it would bring more cool people in or not. I think at the end of the day, probably yes. But does that mean they're going to be there forever? Uh, no, I wouldn't be. I wouldn't be convinced of that. Um, And I think at the end of the day, when you're talking about people, wherever they lie on the spectrum of cool versus like hyper nerd, um, if you're really genuinely seeking God, that hype and that stuff, even if it brings you in, is not going to sustain like a genuine faith. And I think that's one of the things that made me sort of distance myself from that kind of Christianity, because I think it has a place and I think it can be helpful in getting people in the door, but I think people really want meaning and purpose and answer to the deeper questions more than palatable Christianity.
Mhm. Yeah, I thought of that question because I've heard Paul say a couple times that there were these evangelical approaches where they would target the cool kids in high school, and they're like, if we could convert that kid, then all the other kids
Yep.
will,
Well, yeah, Young Life is like a big thing
Uh,
about that.
okay.
When I was a Protestant, I disliked Young Life so much because I worked at a burger joint where all the Young Life kids would come every Monday and they would just tear everything apart. And it's like, and it's an outreach group, but like that was like the perception that people got of like Christians, and it drove me insane. But yeah, Young Life's a big one like that. But I mean, I was a part of a church that was a college ministry, and a lot of times the people would target like sorority girls or what fraternity guys and try to get them in. And I think part of it is because some of the people who started the church were in fraternities and sororities, and so they have a heart for them. But another part of it is, like get these football players in, get these like cool party kids in, get them to change their life, and that'll lead to other things, and we can have our. It's they don't mean it this callous the way that I'm talking about it, but like you get your mole in the hen house, and then eventually we'll convert them all.
All the dominoes will fall eventually.
Yeah, but not they mean it in not such a devious way that I'm explaining it. It actually comes from a genuine place, I think, but there is these strategies, and I think sometimes they're a little dangerous.
Yeah, so I sort of have a bit of a question. Well, unless anyone else has a question that they'd like to share.
No, go for it,
Do it.
Andrew.
All right, so I mean, I don't know how true this is, but I've always just since joining this Discord, I've felt this movement toward a lot of times Orthodox or Catholicism, and I just wonder what I feel like. Sometimes there's the people that are just like, oh, I want to go back, and I just wonder what people think about that, because I mean, Cassidy, you're sort of in a floaty position, but Orthodox leaning, and then Dave, you had some going towards Orthodox, obviously, and then Charlie, I wonder what you sort of see from, potentially the people that you maybe see leaving, or maybe a lack of leaving, and sort of you can reject my hypothesis of people going more back to Orthodox or Catholicism.
Well, I can't speak to everyone who's doing that, of course, but
Yeah.
I mean, I would just reiterate what I said earlier, that and I'll just make it specific for Orthodoxy, that if you're thinking about joining the Orthodox Church, it should be about what it is rather than what it is not.
Mm-hmm.
So it should not be about running away from something. It should be about running to something. And so I see that sometimes where people are running away from this horrible experience they had in some other church, and they think that and they have this idolized vision of what the Orthodox Church is, and they don't understand that Orthodoxy has its own baggage as well. And that type of person may not last very long. They may get disillusioned with the Orthodox Church and then kind of hop to something else, to try to find that utopia that we all know doesn't exist. So, yeah, I mean, if you're gonna look into Orthodoxy, look into it for what it is, rather than being angry at something else and being glad that it's not that thing that you're angry at.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I found orthodoxy in a place where I had realized the denomination that I was in was wearing on me more than I thought. And I didn't hate it. I just realized there were all of these things going through deconstruction and then trying to enter back into sort of this evangelical, non denominational place um, that just wasn't the same and didn't feel the same to me. And I had stuck it out for a long time thinking, okay, this is okay. But I actually went to a Protestant church in Portland that made me realize how how bothered I was about all of this stuff and how it actually wasn't healthy. I always describe the experience of like it was as if I had been treading water, and then finally I realized that I was in the shallow end and I could stand up and breathe. And I think for me it was like, oh, okay, this thing that I'm doing is actually not healthy, and I'm not going to sit and abandon it, but like I'm going to be open to something else too, because I just don't think this is actually where I'm supposed to be. And um and so then after I had that experience, I kept running into I kept meeting Orthodox people online, and um yeah, I talked with a person who was Orthodox, and they have a doctorate in church history, and they were talking about their experience a little bit of converting to Orthodoxy, and saying how when they were teaching at a Protestant university, they noticed that a lot of their Protestant students were converting to Orthodoxy without them even trying, just by teaching the history. And that's what sort of planted the seed, but I wasn't running off going to find Orthodoxy. In fact, I thought I would dislike it because, I'd been to Catholic Mass and I never connected with it. And like the rituals and the spiritual stuff always was sort of, it weirded me out as a Protestant. Even when like the Protestants tried to do weird ritual prayer stuff, it didn't contemplate. So I just figured I'm probably not going to like this. But I eventually went to a Vesper service, and I just had this experience that was so different that made me just realize how little I knew about Protestantism. And I knew some, but not enough to call myself one. And through talking with the priest and just the way that they approached the questions and approached me and dealt with me as a person, it was really intriguing. And for the first time, I wanted to know more about the religion, not from a skeptical place, but like a real, genuine, earnest interest. And so all of those things made me, it was just a different experience for me in my exploration of religion. So it made me more drawn to it. And I still haven't started a conversion process. I think I want to make sure I know what it is before I just jump into it, and I don't want to make an emotional decision about a religious choice and tying my horse to something. But that's sort of why I got drawn to it. But I recently had a conversation with a friend of my parents who works at Phoenix Seminary, and his son became Anglican, and he was talking about how a lot of people in our generation are being drawn to more traditional versions of Christianity because they're missing something in the sacred that a lot of Protestant non-denominational churches don't offer, because their parents were trying to break away from that tradition. They felt stifled by that. So it's this sort of weird cycle. So I think there's some of that where people just have like in millennial generation have a craving for the sacred and are moving towards that and are frustrated with Protestant culture or some of that more modern culture. But I think, yeah, it's very individualized and depends on the person.
I would echo. I would say the things that when I've seen people move away from the tradition, I've seen it's mostly people that have been involved in, like, I hate to say this, but either non-denominational churches or mega churches. And they move away because I know that millennials usually get a bad rap, and I'm going to give them a good one here. Most of the millennial generation are doers. They actually want to go do something, right? And they're drawn more towards the more traditional because there's it's action based. Like they actually get to participate in everything, and they don't feel like they get that participation in larger churches, so they move away from it. Now the ones that you don't have moving away from it are the elderly, because they're past that phase, right? Like their expectation is they're going to go in, they're going to sing some music, they're going to hear a sermon, they're going to drop some money in the plate, and they're going to go out. It's not that they're bad people, it's that they've moved past the actionable thing. So I see a lot of younger generation moving more towards the Orthodox or Catholic side. And then I see some of the middle, I want to say, and then even some of the like mid 30s coming in because they're like, I grew up in this and I don't understand any of it. They feel like they've been failed because they don't understand any of it. So it's usually the ones that grew up in the tradition that are moving the way of Protestants, and the Protestants that grew up in the tradition that are like, I don't feel like I have anything to do. I can't serve. I have no purpose, that are moving the other direction, which is understandable on both sides.
Great. That's all great. Well, we have time for one more quick question, if anyone has anything.
I don't have a question, but it might be a question.
Perfect.
What this is going back a little bit to the beginning of the conversation when you guys were talking, and Cassidy said something about living out the story. And as someone who was not raised religious, was raised more of a practice whatever you want, do whatever you want. What eventually brought me to God was seeing my wife embody the faith in a way that I've never seen before. And through her telling me that there's something higher than even her that loves me, was that gave me that understanding that I never had in over 30 years. And that is something that I don't see people do at work. I don't see people even do at the shopping malls, or offering out a way to help out with some very difficult task, or it maybe paying some bills, or I'm not saying giving a ride, or things like that. But when I confronted a Christian one time and I asked him this question, and I asked him a question: why aren't Christians being Christians at work? And then he felt offended. And that's kind of like what I've experienced at work. And I think we don't have in our culture people who are really living out the story. But we can see a Muslim living out the story. We can see a Hindu living out the story because they're wearing their dress. Or the Jewish people, they're wearing the hat. And I don't even know who's a Christian at my job. So that I think living out the story and figuring out how to participate in a way that it shows what you're doing, it's extremely valuable. Because once I became a Christian, and I was able to understand what I was missing. The people who trusted me from the past were now asking me questions. What changed? And that has helped kind of some people really take a look at the Bible a bit more seriously, and 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 by through my story and my conversion and my attitude at work, they've seen that there's something there that wasn't there before. So I think that's what's missing in our culture. We're not really truly living out the story.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the thing that I've realized, because I spent 3 years being a Christian, but not going to church every Sunday, because I think after 21 years of only being in a church, I wanted to figure out what it meant to be a Christian outside of a building, how to be the church. And through that experience, I saw plenty of people out who weren't even religious living out the story better than Christians were. Like, I've met atheists who have a truer sense of how to live than some Christians who are following the book and following all the rules. And so I think there is a lot of room for us to embrace the story and let Jesus challenge our categories and perceptions and change us. And it's not always going to happen overnight, and we're going to struggle. But I think that constant pursuit of embodying Jesus so we can live a better story is going to help fix a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the church. And in some ways, it's the simplest solution, but also the most difficult.
And you don't need. My wife never read the Bible. I never saw my wife reading the Bible. And my wife was raised Catholic. She pretty much understands the sacrament and all that stuff. But she was just she was acting her faith. She was acting out the story. And the people at work who did know the Bible, and sometimes they used to quote some of the Bible, it didn't make any sense to me because the way they behaved at work didn't match whatever they were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Bible. I've read the Protestant Bible in five times in 10 days. I got 10 more days to read, but in some ways I think it's helped me understand the story better. But sometimes I think it stops us from seeing the forest through the trees. We get so caught up on the little analyzations that we're not looking at the whole picture. And so I think there are benefits to that Protestant version of understanding the Bible and understanding its context and knowing all of those things. But I think sometimes it can do a disservice to living a better story. So it's a tricky balancing act.
I have a little story about it's kind of a symbolism happens story. Now that I think of it, it just actually dawned on me when I was thinking about telling this story. I was like, holy crap! So I met a man in India. He was an Indian man, and he it was in a rather rural area. So he's actually an indigenous person, and he couldn't read, but he was an evangelist. So at some point he had heard about Jesus and decided that this was the truth, and was so excited about it that he just took it upon himself to go village to village and proclaim the gospel. But he couldn't read, and he had a bicycle that had just the steel rim, no rubber tires, that he rode, and he had a pair of shoes that had no soles. So they literally just covered the tops of his feet, and underneath it, he was barefoot, right? And when he would come into someone's house, he would take them off. Um, and then, because that's what you do in India, you take your shoes off and then sit, right? Um, and I remember looking at him, and he literally glowed, and I thought, I am nothing compared to this man. And he had, like when I was thinking about telling the story, I thought he had no foundation, as we would love to say, right? As Christians, he had no rubber tires, he had no soles on his shoes, and he couldn't read. All of what we consider foundational in order to be a Christian, he didn't have them, and yet he was doing it. He was literally doing it. And I guess the takeaway for me on that story was that all these things always boil down to the person's heart and their intention, and loving each other, whether one is a Pentecostal or an Orthodox Christian, is a matter of seeing each other's hearts, I think. And I guess the one question that has been kind of running through my head listening to this is, how do you protect yourself from tribalism? Because I think that is really what all of the real big differences boil down to, is some form of tribalism. And how do you protect yourself from that? Like I was reading recently in Revelation, the 7 letters to the churches, and I read a small commentary on it. And what was interesting was there's actually a pattern to the way that Christ speaks to each church, and the pattern is it starts with a praise of all the good things they're doing, and then it goes into an admonition for the things that they're not doing right, and then it goes into a promise. And I thought, that's how God is. He sandwiches the thing that we need to do better in between love, right? Yeah, anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Oh,
I mean, I guess. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
you go.
I was just going to say, I think to answer your question about tribalism, I think a big thing we can do is to understand first before we seek to be understood. Because if you're taking the time to really understand someone, it's hard to see them as other. And the more that we seek to actually understand people, there's just a genuine interest, or they're gonna probably want to understand you too, and that's a big part of it.
Yeah, I think curiosity, being just like, I want to dig into some of this theology and just be, in a sense, my guide. Like, you're sort of the person that knows more about this, and hold my hand through the Orthodox forest, Dave. I don't know what's going on here. So that's sort of that's sort of how I think it should go, and be humble about it, and be caring for the other person, in a sense. When the tribes form, to break it down, just sort of be like a person that wants to know the tribe.
Yeah, I think that you made a really good point there, Andrew, when you said be humble about it. I think that is actually key.
Yeah, and love a bit too. But
All right, everyone. It's 10 o'clock. It's been a great discussion. I really appreciate everyone coming out. Thank you especially to our panelists. I will hopefully in the next 2 or 3 days get this posted somewhere. I'm not sure exactly, but it will be advertise on Discord. Yeah, thank you again. It's
Yeah.
been great.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Have a good evening.